I'm Heather Saxton, and I'll be the moderator today. This afternoon we have Bill Centrella, who will be discussing microbiology special projects and how to use them to support your product. Bill Centrella is the Special Project Manager for Eurofins Microbiology Laboratories based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He has over 20 years of hands-on food microbiology experience, including working in both in-plant and in third-party laboratories. Bill is SQF and HACCP certified and has performed a number of projects in various sectors of the food industry, including meat, poultry, dairy, and ready-to-eat products. Additionally, Bill has performed validation work for several prominent companies in the food safety arena, such as test kit manufacturers, sanitation chemical providers, and processing equipment manufacturers. Before we get started, we just want to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available within the next 2 days for viewing. We will send out the recording as well as the slides to all those who are in attendance via email. During the webinar, please go ahead and submit your questions throughout, and we'll address them at the end. Any questions that are not followed up on during the presentation we'll follow up on individually afterwards. To submit a question, you want to go to the questions area on the dashboard of GoToWebinar, type in your question, and then just click submit. So with that, we'll go ahead and get the presentation started, and I'll turn things over to Bill.
Thank you for joining us. Let me just get my settings set up here. Again, like Heather said, I've been in the projects arena for maybe about 10 of those 20 years. I don't know whether that makes me old or experienced, so hopefully it's more the experience side of that. I do enjoy working with special projects. It's kind of a nice way to get involved with a number of different clients, different industries. It's nice to get out of the lab environment, and it also is a good way, I find, to be involved more directly in food safety. A lot of times the samples that we get here at the laboratory, they're just sort of the same kind of thing day in and day out for us. I mean, obviously they're important. It's important to have those check samples going through, but it is kind of interesting to be out there on what might be considered the cutting edge of that. So that'll go over our agenda a little bit. We're going to introduce and define special projects. It's kind of a difficult topic to hold into one definition, but we'll at least go over some of the main types of different projects. We'll overview the typical styles of them. We'll go into some details in what each one of those styles means. And then finally, we'll look at the special project process from your point of view, how we start off special projects, the different points that you'll see along the way. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about ways that special projects can help you out. So before we get going, I understand that every good presentation has to have a good pie chart. So this is the best one I could think of that applied to a nice food product. Hopefully, if it's not your lunch break right now, that isn't making you overly hungry, or at least it's making you think about dessert. So okay, so what is a special project? Well, just like we have written here, the Special Products Department covers a wide range of services not covered by your standard laboratory testing. Like I said, those check samples, those environmental swabs, those kind of things are obviously very, very important. But every now and then you run into a question that you can't really answer from that kind of standard data that you're getting. So some good examples of that would be development, validation, or implementation of a new testing methodology, comparing the performance of a new testing platform against a given standard. Validation of pathogen control, that's a really big one. A good example of that is checking on validating a CCP. Some shelf life investigation, that also comes under the special project umbrella. And then I have a couple of good examples of some regulated processes, things that have some definite examples of things to work from, like antimicrobial effectiveness or determination of whether a product requires refrigeration. In general terms, special projects will get written up as a proposal, including a price quote. You'll be able to look at that and make any kind of comments or changes to that. Upon completion of the project, we'll write up a separate report with the project data and conclusions, and that'll be submitted back to you. So it'll run a little bit differently than your standard. I send in my samples and I get my C of A, but hopefully that'll get the information that you're looking for in really, really broad strokes. So we'll start talking about some example special projects. The biggest one I've got here, we're starting off with method validation. This is sort of when maybe you're trying to extend a matrix. Let's say that you want to work with like a PCR methodology for salmonella, for example, but there'll be a certain number of matrices that are approved for use in that product. Maybe your product isn't one of those matrices, but you definitely want to use the advantages of that method. This is the sort of special project that would help you be able to answer whether that method is actually applicable to your product. So we'd start off by determining a standard method for comparison. In that example with salmonella, this would probably be something like the FDA BAM or the USDA method, something that absolutely definitely covers your product. That would be the gold standard that you use to compare to the method that we're going to be working on. Once we have the two methods defined, then we'll inoculate the target matrix with a specified level of analyte. In this case, we're talking about salmonella. Probably what we'd end up doing is doing that right at about the limit of detection and then maybe about a level above that. The reason for doing that is that you want to end up getting partial positives when we do the statistical comparison. It doesn't really do you a lot of good to have a completely positive set of samples. It's kind of like having a too numerous to count plate count. It doesn't really give you a definite number to do a statistical comparison with. So we'll try to find a level of detection. We might go a level above just to be sure of that, or maybe a level below. This is usually where some of the art of the science comes in, trying to find exactly where that limit of detection is going to be. If there are reruns, it's usually for that reason. We'll then go ahead and run the test using both of those methods, and then we'll statistically compare the performance of both methods in that specific matrix. If it's like an AOAC style validation, usually they do 20 positive samples and then 5 negative samples. Obviously, you want all the negatives to return a negative. As I said before, though, you want to have like a partial positive of those 20. Something like 5 to 15 is usually a good number. And if you get a statistically comparable number of positive results in both the gold standard method and then the method that we're comparing against, then you can turn around and say that these methods would be equivalent. And in our salmonella example, then you can turn around and say, well, I can go ahead and use this methodology to cover my samples, because even though the manufacturer doesn't necessarily say that that sample works with that matrix, you'd be able to produce that study and say, well, we've examined that, and now we know that this method produces a statistically equivalent method as the gold standard. Another major category of special projects would be pathogen control. In fact, this is probably the number one thing that we end up doing on a regular basis. This is, as a broad stroke, pathogen control is kind of covering whether you have a process or perhaps an ingredient, something like an anti-listeria ingredient that might be in your product. What we would end up doing is then trying to simulate that intervention in a laboratory setting. If it's something like an ingredient, then obviously it's just a matter of sending us the product formulated with that ingredient, and then perhaps the product formulated without that ingredient. If it's something like an intervention, like a heat step or a cool step, or some other kind of treatment like a wash, that might be something that we need to determine whether we can simulate that in laboratory. That's usually the best example. If we can do it in laboratory, then we can use the actual pathogen that you're talking about. If it's not really a practical thing to use a surrogate organism for that, then if it's not a practical thing, we'd have to develop a surrogate organism and then go in plant and use that treatment. That's usually the less optimal result. It has the advantage of being able to use the actual treatment in the actual conditions, but the disadvantage is that we usually can't go in and use the actual pathogen, unless perhaps you have like a test kitchen or a pilot plant, something like that, that we can absolutely separate out these known positive samples from your actual processing samples. So what we would end up doing then is taking that target matrix and adding usually a pretty high level of analyte. What we're trying to do is show that the intervention kills a large amount of that. Usually we're talking about 5 or 6 logs, sometimes even more than that. Sometimes you want to show complete clearance of that. Some heat studies might want to see a 10D process. That'd be 10 logs of that. So again, we're going to be talking about inoculating a pretty high level of analyte. This is also another portion where the art comes into the science. Sometimes it's very difficult to find a way to accurately and scientifically valid method for introducing that target organism to the matrix. The example I'm trying to show with some cute clip art here is trying to do a spray application. If you're trying to do a surface application like that, sometimes that's the best way to do it rather than a direct spread. It really depends on what kind of contamination you're trying to simulate. If it's something interior to the product, you might do an injection. If it's something that you expect to get dripped onto a product, something like listeria that it's picking up from the environment, what I'm trying to show in the cartoon might be the way to go, where you spray it on the surface or drip it on the surface. Sometimes that's something we have to play around with a little bit to make sure that the amount of organisms that we're trying to apply to the product are, well, first applied in the way that you would see them applied in plant, and then secondly, applied in a manner that we can still recover them at a high level without the intervention. Those would be our positive controls for that. We would just not use that intervention, or if it was something like we talked before about an annulistearial ingredient, that product would, you'd use the product formulated with the ingredient and the product formulated without the ingredient, and then compare the results from the two. Sometimes after a given storage period, especially like I said, we're talking about the anti-listearial, that might be something you want to hold for a period of time, say 2 weeks, a month, whatever your shelf life might be. For things like a CCP control, it's usually immediate. We want to show that intervention, that cook step, that chemical treatment, whatever that might be. We'll apply that, and then we'll plate the 2 sets of samples onto solid media to be enumerated. The idea would be to use as non-selective a media as practical, because a lot of times those selective plates will have ingredients that will hamper the recovery of the organism. Sometimes we'll do duplicate platings. We'll do something like a TSA. If it's a listeria one, for example, we might do MOX or we might do Palcam and use that with TSA, try to compare the recovery on the 2 types of solid media. If there's a significant difference between the two, then we know that we should really kind of rely on the TSA results because they're showing better recovery. If they're equal, then I might want to use the more selective to be sure that this is actually what we're recovering. In either case, we would probably pull representative isolates off of those plates, confirm those biochemically, make sure that what we're counting as the recovered organism actually represents our target. When we have those plates, we'll compare the counts of the untreated samples to the treated samples, and that should give us our log reduction due to the treatment. Again, whether that treatment be an ingredient in there that was supposed to kill off any contaminant that was introduced to the product, or whether that's a treatment like a cook step that was supposed to kill anything that would be going through that process. Another good category of special projects would be shelf life studies. I think this is the thing that most people would be familiar with doing. Essentially, all we're doing here is simulating the retail storage of the product. We'd want to either determine the expected shelf life or determine a revised shelf life. A lot of times people have an off-the-cuff shelf life of, say, 3 months or 6 months, and they want to run a study to make sure that that actually matches the performance they expect, or sometimes whether they can extend that performance out a little bit. We need to determine the typical storage conditions that you'd want to hold these products under. Obviously, we want to simulate that retail storage as closely as possible. The data that we're determining, if we're holding it refrigerated, you expect it to be room temperature. Obviously, we're going to see a different shelf life than what you would expect. And then at specific intervals, we'll assay for threats to product shelf life. This is one of the things we would define going in, like how you would want to define a decrease in the acceptability of the product. Oftentimes, that's microbial in nature. You basically want to say, okay, you've reached the end of shelf life when you start growing up a number of aerobes or maybe lactic acid bacteria or yeasts or molds, for example. Typically, we're not really doing pathogens at this stage. A lot of times, it's more just the generic threats to product shelf life. Things like a lactic acid bacteria that'll grow out and it'll produce lactic acid and sour your product, or it might be gas-performing organisms, excuse me, gas-producing microorganisms, things like that. There also may be chemical targets we might look at. If it's an oil-based product, we might want to look at something like rancidity. Over time, the oils in there will probably produce off flavors, things like that. Or it could be a nutritional element, something like that we can assay for over time. A lot of times it includes an organoleptic component, how the product looks, if there's an odor when we open the package. In rare instances, maybe it might be taste. We sort of try to avoid doing taste. You never know. With a microbial kind of situation, maybe it's better not to taste that product. Although it is certainly true that a lot of the organoleptic results will go bad before you see actual assayable microbial results. A lot of times the souring of lactic acid or gas production or off odors or things like that will be apparent way before any kind of counts that we might be able to pull off of a plate. As I said, we'll test that at predetermined intervals. Usually something regular. If it's 6 months or a year, that might be monthly. If it's a shorter time frame, that might be weekly. For really short time frames, it might be daily or a couple of days. Depending on the needs of what we're looking at, sometimes we stagger those intervals towards the end of shelf life. So you might start off looking at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months. But as you approach what you expect to be the regular end of shelf life, then you might start tightening those up a little bit. You might start looking at every other week or possibly every week, just so that you can find a good end point for that. Shelf life is usually defined by the last acceptable result, be that microbial, chemical, or I guess in this picture here, I think this is an organoleptic failure. She's not very happy with what's being put in front of her. I'm going to guess it's the peas and not the chicken product. But that's a good example of organoleptic failure right there. Another big category is antimicrobial effectiveness. In a lot of ways, this is similar to a pathogen control product that was the project that we spoke about before. You're going to take that target microorganism, you're going to put that in the product. Normally, these are products that already incorporate an antimicrobial ingredient, and basically what you're doing is you're using a specified set of methods to determine whether it's effective at controlling these target organisms. We'll introduce those into the product. Again, like we said, sometimes this can be the art of the science, trying to figure out the best way to take that product and introduce it into take that analyte and introduce it into the product in both a way that it's well distributed in the product and able to both contact the antimicrobial and be assayed well. We'll assay to determine a log reduction or prevention of outgrowth, very much like we said with the pathogen control products. Usually these also marry this up with the shelf life studies that we talked before. Typically, this is the sort of thing that you want to see the antimicrobial effectiveness over time. So there'll be specified time frames that will look for these results. There'll be failure points built into those. The specific reference for an example would be USP 51. That's for cosmetics in a lot of ways. I have those little cosmetic examples down there at the bottom. That includes some very distinct targets, some very well-defined portions where there are pull dates. Usually that's weekly for about 28 days. There's a definite failure point for both fungal elements and for microbial elements. And again, the references there including specific organisms and the specific log reduction targets that you need to hit. Another good example of a kind of a subgroup of special projects would be determination of whether a product requires refrigeration. Sometimes this gets referred to as determining whether it's a potentially hazardous product or a product that requires time and temperature control for safety. The first place to start with a project like this is to look at the food product itself. There are specific combinations of pH and water activity that will prevent the growth of groups of pathogens. If you know that your product falls into some of those groups, you don't necessarily need to look at really broad swathes of organisms. You can kind of limit that down to, okay, these are the specific threats for this specific product, so we'll do a test study against those instead of doing a really broad range of threats. The remaining potential threats become your challenge organisms, and then you inoculate that into the product. Like you said before, this is the tricky part. Store that usually at room temperature, and then assay at specific time points for recovery. If your challenge organisms are controlled, if you're not really seeing, usually this is the definition of control is less than 1 log of outgrowth, then that product is either not a potentially hazardous food or does not need time and temperature control. Bakery products are a good example of things that get used for this process a lot, but it is kind of applicable to a lot of different types of products. Now we'll go into the special project process. And we kind of talked a little bit about the different types of projects that you might be involved in. So how would you go about having this happen? Well, essentially, you would start out by not too differently than the way you arrange for your standard testing. Your initial contact might be through our sales personnel or a customer service contact where you're doing your regular testing already. I promise that the people who are answering the phone are slightly older than the example I'm showing here, but and just as professional. The client will typically be forwarded to a special projects person, probably me, for a follow-up contact. From there, we'll discuss what you're actually looking to accomplish with your project, what kind of question you need to answer, what may be the best way to approach that question. We'll determine the kind of matrices that you need. Sometimes shelf life is a good example. You might have 30, 40, 50 different kinds of products, but hopefully we can break that down into specific subgroups, and you can do an example of that. You could do a worst-case scenario, and then try to apply that to the rest of those rather than kind of just going way over the top on a number of different types of products. We'll also determine the targets of interest that you might need. We'll try to get all that information together and draft an initial proposal for you, which I promise I won't write on parchment with a quill pen, but we'll get that out to you. From that point on, you can we'll internally review that draft. We'll ensure that those inoculation methods and methods of enumeration, the proposed storage conditions, things like that are going to be scientifically valid. Again, this is where it comes under the heading of the art of the science. This is kind of where sometimes the more opinions you get, the better in determining what might be the best way to set up a given project, what might be the more appropriate inoculation method, if there's an organism that might be slightly more applicable to the matrix that we're talking about. We'll correct any, that should be typos, that should probably be poor grammar, and spell checking problems, which always tend to creep in there. It's my absolute nightmare that I'm going to get a spell check thing that finds its way out to a client, and it's going to be the totally inappropriate word. After any corrections or edits have been incorporated, that approved proposal will get submitted to the client. The client obviously will have their own internal review process on that. They may have a question about using a particular methodology, what might be a better approach, what might work better for them. Sometimes it's a question of what is a practical amount of sample to send. Usually I would say we tend not to need very large sets of samples for this, but it depends very much on the type of project and the type of thing that we're trying to simulate. Sometimes you need to send that full retail product in retail packaging to make the best kind of simulation. Other times we can send subsamples of product, or you could send a large bulk pack product, and we could break it down in that kind of situation. Any requested changes will get reviewed and incorporated into the proposal before we begin the testing. That final approval will go through to the client. After any edits or issues get resolved, you can indicate your final approval by signing the proposal, which we'll keep on hold of. If you're already an EML customer, then we can just jump right in. Sometimes we need to have some onboarding forms sent out to you to make sure that we can get the project entered correctly into our LIMS system, and we can make sure all the paperwork is all right and the T's are crossed and the I's dotted. After receipt of the project will commence as per the proposal. If we find out in running the proposal, sometimes we discover that our proposed inoculation method doesn't work, or there's some other difficulty with the proposal going on, we'll probably get back in touch with you at that point and say, this is the situation we run into. This is the suggestion that we have to move forward. And then the client will have the opportunity to say, like, okay, yep, that sounds good. Or we can reassess the project. We can reassess what we need to do at that point. The raw data will get compiled as the project goes forward. Depending on the size of the project, if it's a very quick project, usually it's just a matter of run the test, get the data, get the results out. If it's a long-term project, one of those antimicrobial studies or a shelf life study, the client could request an update at a specified interval. If you've got a year-long shelf life, obviously you'd like to know the progress of it as you're going along. At the completion of the project, the data will be summarized in a final report, which will have all the materials and methods written out. There'll be raw data observations, final summary of the result, and any conclusions that are applicable from the data. So then to sum it up, how can we assist you with special projects? You could be assured that a new intervention or ingredient does exactly what the manufacturer is promising you. Lots of sales guys will come into your plant and say, this ingredient is fantastic and it kills every single antimicrobial contaminant, or excuse me, every single microbial contaminant you can think of. They'll promise you the moon if you only buy 9 million gallons of my product. But you could get a set of sample product from them. We could do a quick validation study. You get an idea of whether it actually does perform as per their promises that they're giving you. Validation of CCPs. That's a very big thing coming up right now with FSMA, with increased auditing and increased use of inspections, things like that. So CCPs are actually coming under a lot of scrutiny these days. If you don't have really good validations for them, I know a lot of people. Some of the plant locations I worked in, we were using 20 or 30-year-old papers to prove that the CCP that we were doing works really well. And all that is one awkward question away from getting your HACCP plan not approved. So we can do that for you. We can definitely validate a CCP, whether that's cook step, cool step, whatever that might be. Data for corrective actions or risk assessments. When you do have those kind of situations come along and somebody says, like, well, how do you know that that works? You implement your corrective action. We can validate that corrective action for you. Confirmation or updated posted shelf life information. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about shelf life in general. You know, you can either confirm what you have out there, or if you have a suspicion that you might be able to go 2 or 3 months past your shelf life, we can definitely check that out for you. Proof that a faster or cheaper methodology produces statistically comparable results to the gold standard. That was that first set of projects that we talked about. When you have a methodology that you either want to extend to a new matrix, or if somebody, again, comes to you and says, I've got this handy-dandy machine that if you'll buy and you'll spend $1 million worth of test kits, you'll be able to return your results around so much faster. But then you go to your inspector and they go like, well, I don't know if that works on that matrix. We can do a validation study for that, and we can support that claim. We can support a change in processing conditions. That's the same sort of situation. You know you're going to add a new chemical, a new process. We can make sure that it meets that goal that you expect it to. And then lastly, we have third-party verification of antimicrobial performance. It's all well and good to include antimicrobials in your products, but you will at one point need to show that they do what you expect them to do. So with that, I guess I'll turn that back over to Heather and see if we've got any questions. Anything else I can answer for you?
Sure, thanks, Bill. We have a couple questions that we can go over here. First question is, what pathogens do you have surrogates available for?
That's a really good question. Some typical examples of the big ones that we'll tend to work with a lot will be Salmonella, E. coli 0157H7, or Listeria monocytogenes. The best one that we have a surrogate for would be Salmonella. Heat-resistant Salmonella, there's a lot of research that shows you can use a particular strain of Enterococcus faecalis for that, especially after it's been acid shocked. It has very similar heat resistance properties to the pathogenic Salmonellas out there. That's a good surrogate to use. For 0157, typically you end up using generic E. coli, which isn't the greatest surrogate in the world. A lot of people don't want to have E. coli in their plan either, but that is obviously the closest match to something like an 0157. You have the same situation for Listeria monocytogenes. The best match to it would be something like a Listeria innocua, something that's not a actual pathogen, but performs very, very closely to it. Again, the best surrogate is probably that Enterococcus faecalis for Salmonella, but we'll definitely work at providing at least the non-pathogenic alternative to a target organism that we need.
Great, thank you. Next question, what is a typical turnaround time for a project?
That's another good question. That very much depends on exactly what we're trying to accomplish. They can be very, very short if we're looking at a very simple kind of CCP validation. Something like a cook study, it's just a matter of doing, let's say, a statistically valid group of samples, something like 20 or 30 of them. You could presumably have that done in a day, a couple of days to develop the plates from them, get the counts, and get a report out. Most of those kind of things would be done within the course of about a week or 2 weeks. On the other hand, if you have something that needs to be stored over a long term, something like a shelf life, that can be a series of months, 12 months, 18 months. I've seen one that goes to 24 months. So it very much depends on the kind of application that we're looking at. Generally speaking, though, it's a relatively short time frame.
Okay. Do you perform any studies using a viral target?
At this point, not out of this facility. There's a lot of different kind of assays that need to be done that are slightly more complicated than we might do for bacterial targets. We do have some external partners that we might be able to set that up for. So that's very much going to be tailored to exactly what you need to do and exactly what organisms we need to work with. That's something that's definitely a growth portion of our industry. Obviously, there's been a lot of viral associated food outbreaks, so that's definitely an up-and-coming portion of that.
Okay. All right. Next question says, how do you know what pathogens of concern are based on pH characteristics?
There's some published guidelines for that. There's some things in from NACMIF or other organizations like that that you can look at as references. Usually that's pretty well defined. You can pretty much figure out which pathogens are going to grow in those kind of conditions. Most of the time that's pegged to pH and water activity. To a certain extent, some of that's moisture, but pH and water activity are usually the main things that you can look at.
Okay. Just one more question before we wrap things up today. Can Eurofins perform accelerated shelf life projects?
That's another one that depends on very much what we're going to work with. For microbial targets, well, I guess just take a step back. For chemical or nutritional targets, definitely. There's a lot of good research out there that has mechanisms for doing accelerated shelf life. We may need to use some off-site storage for that, depending on the conditions that we need to hold them under, what your standard conditions are versus your accelerated condition. Those are very easy to accelerate. It's a little more difficult to accurately accelerate a microbial process. Basically, the best description I heard for that is that biological turning up the heat and they go faster. The best example I heard is if you have a pregnant lady and you put her in a sauna, she doesn't have the baby any faster. But there are some versions of that can be done. Usually it's not quite as simple as a chemical or a nutritional process. So again, like I say, it depends on the targets that we're looking for.
Okay, great. And one note on the accelerated shelf life studies, we actually are doing another webinar in January about that topic. So if you guys continue to have some questions about the types of things we can do accelerated studies for, that might be a good opportunity to get some questions answered there. If we didn't address any questions that you have about our special projects on the webinar, please feel free to reach out and contact us. Bill's got his contact information up here on the screen for you. So that's really all we have today. So we just wanted to take a moment to remind you that the webinar recording will be sent out to you within the next day or so, and as well as the slides. And then again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. So I just want to take a moment and thank Bill for presenting today. And
thank you very much, everybody, and I'm glad you put up with my terrible jokes, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, Bill.